Chapter 1: The Origin of Passion.
Théo wasn't like other students. From a young age, he always displayed an insatiable curiosity about the world around him. His parents still remembered the first time he saw a volcano on TV. It was during a documentary aired on a Sunday afternoon. Théo, barely 5 years old, watched the screen with wide eyes, absorbing every image of the glowing lava flows rushing down the slopes of an erupting volcano. From that day on, volcanoes became a real obsession for him. He wanted to know everything: why they existed, how they worked, what was happening inside. He spent hours flipping through books at the local library, asking his parents to read him complex passages he couldn't yet understand. His room gradually filled with posters of volcanoes, and he often dreamed of becoming a volcanologist, a career that appealed to him more and more as he grew older.
Chapter 2: School and Early Concerns.
When Théo started school, his teachers quickly noticed his particular passion. Madame Dupuis, in particular, who taught the 5th grade class, remembered being struck by the depth of the questions he asked. Théo wasn't satisfied with simple answers. He wanted to know the whys and hows, to understand the details, and never hesitated to raise his hand, even when he knew the answer might be complicated or even unknown. This sometimes caused problems. Some of his classmates began teasing him, calling him the scientist or Mr. Know-it-all, but Théo wasn't discouraged. For him, the pursuit of truth was more important than what others thought of him. His parents strongly supported him, encouraging him to keep asking questions and to feed his curiosity.
Chapter 3: The Lesson on Volcanoes.
One day, while in 5th grade, Madame Dupuis announced that she was going to teach a lesson on volcanoes. As soon as Théo heard this, his heart leapt. This was the subject he'd been waiting for all year. He carefully prepared for the class, reading entire chapters from his books at home, mentally preparing to ask the questions he had accumulated over time. On the day of the lesson, Théo sat at his desk, full of anticipation. Madame Dupuis began by explaining the basics: the difference between an active, dormant, and extinct volcano, how lava rises from the depths of the earth, and the different types of eruptions. But as soon as she started talking about magma, Théo raised his hand. He had a question in mind for a long time: can volcanoes really become completely extinct, or do they always retain some activity, even after thousands of years? But Madame Dupuis, absorbed in her lesson, signaled him to wait.
Chapter 4: The Waiting.
As Madame Dupuis continued to explain the internal mechanisms of volcanoes, Théo, his hand still in the air, began to think. He knew that volcanoes were ancient geological formations, and he wondered if any volcanoes were truly dead or if they all potentially could awaken one day. The minutes passed, and Théo felt his arm growing heavier, but he refused to lower his hand. The other students began to notice. Some looked at him, whispering, while others discreetly mocked him. But Théo was focused on his question, determined to get an answer.
Chapter 5: The Revelation.
After what seemed like an eternity, Madame Dupuis finally finished her lesson. She turned to the class and noticed that Théo's hand was still raised. Intrigued, she stopped and signaled for him to ask his question. Théo took a deep breath and asked about volcanoes. Madame Dupuis smiled. "That's an excellent question, Théo," she replied. She then explained that some volcanoes, after millions of years, can become what are called extinct volcanoes. However, others can remain dormant for extremely long periods and suddenly wake up, as was the case with Mount Vesuvius in Italy. Théo was fascinated. He hadn't realized that volcanoes could harbor such unpredictability. This answer stimulated him even more, and he promised himself to read more about dormant volcanoes and the risks they posed.
Chapter 6: Unexpected Consequences.
Théo's persistence that day had an unexpected effect on the class. His classmates, initially amused by his insistence, began to see him in a different light. Even those who had previously mocked him began to take an interest in what he had asked. After all, he hadn't asked a simple question but something profound and complex. Madame Dupuis noticed this change in attitude. She decided to encourage this collective curiosity by organizing a group project on volcanoes. The students were to divide into teams, choose a famous volcano, and present its characteristics and eruption history. Théo, of course, was thrilled with this idea. He chose to study Mount Saint Helens, a volcano that had experienced a spectacular eruption in 1980.
Chapter 7: The Project.
The volcano project became a central event for the class. Théo threw himself into it wholeheartedly, not only researching information, but also helping his classmates understand complex concepts. He explained how tectonic plates moved beneath the Earth's surface, how magma formed, and why some volcanoes were more explosive than others. As the project progressed, Théo realized that his interest in volcanoes could inspire others. His classmates began asking more sophisticated questions, seeking to understand the mechanisms that govern these sleeping giants. Their presentations became more detailed, and classroom discussions took on a new dimension.
Chapter 8: The Final Presentation.
The day of the final presentation arrived. The classroom was decorated with volcano models, geological maps, and explanatory diagrams. Parents had been invited to come and see their children's work. Théo, wearing his favorite t-shirt featuring an erupting volcano, was nervous but excited. When his turn came, he stood up and began talking about Mount Saint Helens. He explained how the volcano had suddenly exploded after centuries of dormancy, releasing energy equivalent to 500 atomic bombs. He talked about the devastating consequences of the eruption, but also about what scientists had learned by studying this event. The audience was captivated. Théo had managed to convey his passion in a clear and engaging way. At the end of his presentation, the parents and teachers warmly applauded him. Madame Dupuis was particularly proud. She knew that Théo had a gift, not only for understanding volcanoes but also for sharing his knowledge with others.
Chapter 9: A New Path.
After the project's success, Théo felt more confident than ever in his passion. He began keeping a journal where he recorded all his observations and discoveries about volcanoes. He wanted to one day become a recognized expert, perhaps even make important discoveries that could help predict eruptions and save lives.
Chapter 10: The Unforgettable Journey.
The trip to Reunion was a transformative experience for Théo. As he climbed the slopes of Piton de la Fournaise, he felt the heat emanating from the ground, the hidden power beneath his feet, for the first time. He listened intently to the explanations of the volcanologist guide, asked dozens of questions, and lost himself in the contemplation of the lunar landscape surrounding him. The highlight of the trip came when they reached the volcano's crater. Standing at the edge, looking down into the vast chasm, Théo felt a mixture of awe and respect for the forces of nature. It was as if he could feel the Earth breathing, a reminder that this was a living planet, constantly changing and evolving. Back at home, Théo's passion for volcanoes only deepened. He began corresponding with volcanologists, asking them questions and sharing his observations. He also started a blog where he wrote about his experiences and discoveries, hoping to inspire others to share his fascination.
Chapter 11: The Science Fair.
Encouraged by his teachers and parents, Théo decided to enter a national science fair. His project focused on the unpredictability of volcanoes and the importance of monitoring them to prevent disasters. He spent months preparing, gathering data, creating models, and perfecting his presentation. The day of the fair arrived, and Théo presented his project with the same passion and clarity that had won him praise before. The judges were impressed not only by his knowledge, but also by his ability to communicate complex ideas in an understandable way. When the results were announced, Théo was awarded first place. It was a moment of triumph, not just for him but for everyone who had supported him along the way. Madame Dupuis, who had attended the fair, couldn't have been prouder. She knew that Théo had a bright future ahead of him.
Chapter 12: A Future Volcanologist.
As Théo grew older, his passion for volcanoes never waned. He continued his studies, eventually pursuing a degree in geology with a focus on volcanology. His childhood dream of becoming a volcanologist was now within reach, and he was determined to make a difference in the field. He traveled to different parts of the world, studying active volcanoes, collecting samples, and working with other scientists to better understand these powerful natural phenomena. He also dedicated himself to educating the public about the risks and wonders of volcanoes, giving lectures, writing articles, and appearing on documentaries. Years later, Théo returned to his old school to give a talk to the students. Standing in front of a new generation of curious minds, he shared his journey, from the boy who refused to lower his hand in class to the respected volcanologist he had become. He encouraged the students to